for joining me. I'm so glad you're excited to hear more about Rosie Revere. Loving this book. We're already on chapter 18. But let's remind ourselves what happened in the last chapter, in chapter 17. Oh yeah, Rosie was brave and went to her neighbor, Mrs. Lou's house, and asked for help. And Mrs. Lou smiled and said, "I thought you'd never ask." Chapter 18. What page are we on? Page 101. Beep, beep. The old army jeep zoomed around the corner and towards the library. A load of pampas stalks bounced around in the back of the jeep. Beep, beep. The jeep screeched to a halt a few feet from June's canvas. "Would you look at that?" cried Boss. "It's Agnes Lou." Here's a picture. Fluffy end. Pampas grass. What's that say? Stalk. It's hollow and light. And what comes out the bottom? Paint can float up the stalk and onto the fluffy end. "And Rosie," said Ada. She and Iggy ran to the jeep. "Rosie," they said, "what's going on?" Rosie flipped open the glove box and Gizmo hopped out. She chirped happily and flew to the top of the canvas. "June needed lighter brushes," Rosie said, "so I asked Mrs. Lou if we could use one of the pampas stalks from her garden. She cut them all down." Mrs. Lou and Rosie jumped out of the jeep and grabbed a bunch of plumes from the back. "Agnes Lou," said Aunt Rose, "what have you done to your beautiful garden?" "Doesn't matter," said Mrs. Lou. "When a riveteer needs something, I do my part. June needs these more than I do." She pulled a pair of shears from her pocket of her duster and trimmed one of the stalks. "They're lighter than those curtain rods," said Mrs. Lou, "though I would have tried curtain rods too. It was a good design." Rosie looked confused. "You design things?" she asked. Mrs. Lou laughed. "Well, of course I do," she said. "I'm an engineer too, and we engineers have to help each other. That's why I left the bucket of tubes and tapes for you." Rosie thought those had come from Ada and Iggy or the recyclers B&B. She had so many questions, but not enough time to ask them. Aunt Rose and the riveteers crowded in to give Mrs. Lou hugs. They all know her. "Your poor garden," said June. "What were you thinking?" Mrs. Lou raised her hand. "Not another word. It's time to paint." Mrs. Lou handed Rosie a stalk, and Rosie got busy. Within moments, June was painting again. She swooshed the brushes this way and that. It was beautiful. Then, snap! The red stem broke. "Uh-oh," said Rosie. "That's why we brought extras," said Mrs. Lou. Look at that picture. There's Mrs. Lou. All the riveteers. We're moving on to chapter 19. Rosie swapped in a new stalk, and June kept painting. After a few minutes, the blue stem snapped, but Rosie was ready with a replacement. As other stems broke, Rosie swapped them too. Meanwhile, Rosie, Ada, and Iggy learned more about the mysterious Mrs. Lou. Boss explained that Mrs. Lou was a riveteer in the Jeep factory on the other side of the river from the airplane factory. Here's the picture. Things that have rivets: ships, airplanes, jeeps, and jeans. Solid rivet, round rivet, counter, sunk, another round version, pan, flat. All types of rivets. made this very cheap, said Mrs. Lou. I learned a lot about machines during war. It made me want to invent some, so I did. Haven't stopped since. Rosie was amazed. All this time she had lived next door to another engineer and didn't know it. Mrs. Lou seemed to read her mind. You didn't know because I rarely get out of the house except for at night, she said. I have a skin condition that makes me allergic to the sun. Is that why you keep your curtains shut? Asked Rosie. Yes, said Mrs. Lou, but your Aunt Rose lets me know when you've got a project, and I donate what I can to help. I'm glad you like the crates I leave at your house. You do that? Asked Rosie. Of course, said Mrs. Lou. Did you think it was the Tooth Fairy? More like the Tool Fairy, said Aunt Rose. That's a good one. Aunt Rose slapped her knee and laughed out loud. She laughed until she wheezed, and her eyes filled with tears. Soon the whole group was laughing. No one laughed harder than Mrs. Lou. Rosie realized that she had been very wrong about Mrs. Lou. She thought Mrs. Lou was mean and mysterious and did not like her. She should have given Mrs. Lou a second chance. Mrs. Lou smiled at Rosie. You know, Rosie, I could use your help with the doohickey I made to scrub the dishes. It's simply smashing. It sounds amazing, said Rosie. No, said Mrs. Lou. It's simply smashing all my plates. And now I'm almost out of bowls. She laughed again. Rosie laughed too. I'd love to help, said Rosie. It's good to have an engineer for a neighbor, said Mrs. Lou. Rosie smiled back. It is indeed. There they are together. She gave her a second chance, and look at what happened. Wow, well, that's the end of chapter 19. Thanks for joining, friends. I hope you enjoyed. We'll continue in the next video. Have fun choosing your next work today. Hasta luego.